Okay, hear me out. Star Wars is not sci-fi. It's medieval fantasy. Yeah. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Megan Maldonado. I talk about a lot of medieval literature and also its implications in modern media, and today I'm going to talk about Star Wars and, like I just said, why I think it's not a sci-fi story, but let's call it a medieval fantasy with some sci-fi elements, but mainly a medieval fantasy. Don't get mad yet. I have an argument for this. So I think the most compelling connection, first off, is the Jedi Knight, and not just the title, but the whole role of the Jedi Knight. So you have the knights errant, basically, that would go off on quests and romances in medieval literature I'm talking about now. You'd have these knights that would go off and do quests, and then they come back and they have their own adventures and whatnot. And don't the Jedi Knights do exactly the same thing? I mean, they already have the title, first of all. They go off on their own adventures. We hear about those, and you get that more in the non-canonical media. And then they come back, and where do they come back to? They come back to a kind of a court. I know it's a council, but they all sit in a circle just like the round table, because there's not really one head, even though there kind of is. It's Arthur and Camelot, and it's Yoda over at Coruscant Circle, but nevertheless, you have a similar setup for what these knights are supposed to do, not just in the name, but also in their role within the universe. That's medieval stuff. That's not a sci-fi thing. Another reason that I say that Star Wars is more medieval fantasy than sci-fi is we have to actually think about what sci-fi is as a genre. Now, I know the genre is really hard to define. Just about everybody who talks about it can agree upon that. But really, let's get into the origins of sci-fi. If we're trying to get some kind of consistent definition, we can also think of other sci-fi examples and see why Star Wars doesn't actually match up with our understandings of what sci-fi should be. And if it's not sci-fi, then what is it? I think it does fit neatly into medieval fantasy, but let's talk about sci-fi for a second. So the term sci-fi or science fiction or scientific fiction, I think, was the original preferred term. This was all coined by Hugo Gernsback, who ran this magazine, Amazing Stories, what it was called. And he liked his sci-fi stories to actually be fictional imaginations of the future of technology and science, hence science fiction. So the person who's articulating the term for the first time is imagining a genre in which we're looking at the development of technology in the future. It could be very dramatic, it doesn't have to be, but the point is that sci-fi, at least in its origins, is intended to look at future possibilities for technology and maybe how it goes wrong. Isaac Asimov, who was also a professor of biochem at Boston University, I think it was a big science fiction writer, and his idea of science fiction was, quote, "Science fiction can be defined as that branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology." Now, when we're citing, two different people, even if they are really important figures in the field, which shouldn't be discounted, but even though we're citing a couple different people, that doesn't mean, of course, that is what sci-fi is. It can't be anything other. Genres, what defines them, are highly debatable. What defines medieval romance is also debated. So I recognize that, yes, science fiction can have maybe a more fluid definition. Nevertheless, some important figures in the field, even the person who coined the term, had this understanding of science fiction as being an imagination, not just for the future in general, any point, but what the future will bring scientifically, technologically, and how do we grapple with these changes. So think of some other famous sci-fi examples, from Star Trek to Black Mirror, right? Doesn't have to be set in the future, but these events usually are, right? What are we seeing in these? Well, Star Trek, we have a new defined form of space travel. That is, in fact, the whole gist of the show is they are doing exploration that nobody else has done before with technology that the audience has never seen, especially in the 60s. You have all these new discoveries, all these different kinds of technology that are crazy. Black Mirror is a little darker, a lot more skeptical, more like Ray Bradbury-ish of, okay, we have this new technology, isn't it so amazing, but also what comes with it, and is it a good thing? So there's lots that can be done within the field of sci-fi, but some through lines are the emphasis on technology, the emphasis on scientific discovery or possibility or danger, and these stories are often set in the future. I'm not going to say that these are all defining markers or they are all necessary, let's say, but they are all common to the genre. So let's think about Star Wars for a second, according to this rubric, right? Is Star Wars a futuristic story? It's not set in the future. It's a long, long time ago, right? In a galaxy far, far away. Does that mean that it can't be sci-fi? No, but it is curious that we're setting something in the past. It's a cemented and forgotten, not forgotten now because we're telling the story, but it's a distant thing and it's over and done with. There's not this sense of Star Wars about future possibilities for us because it's already done. I think that's important to remember. And I know what you're going to say. Doesn't Star Wars have interesting technology that is futuristic, that would look to the future for scientific advancement? You have lightsabers, you have these blasters that are like these laser pistols, right? You have droids, you have all these interesting telecommunications, you have space travel, that you can travel at the speed of light. Isn't that all sci-fi-ish enough? Doesn't that make it sci-fi? My answer is kind of, but ultimately no, because I don't think that technology, the fear of it, the discovery of it, the development, our reaction to it, I don't think that's the point of Star Wars. I really don't think you can make that argument. Technology is an important feature to Star Wars, kind of, but fundamentally there's something more important that makes it more like medieval fantasy. And that thing that ultimately drives all the action in the Star Wars universe and all the plots and even influences the technology, that thing is the Force. And the Force cannot be considered coalescing with the sci-fi genre and its goals. The Force is too mystical, it's too spiritual, it doesn't line up with the understanding of sci-fi as driven by science and technology, because the Force cannot be rationalized and quantified in the same way. And I'm not acknowledging midichlorians, but even then, I don't think you can make a great argument and say that that's technology. It just seems to be a kind of biological response to the Force. So it still doesn't count as being quantifiable. The Force is not quantifiable. Let's think about some of that technology and whether or not it is just, simple scientific discovery. Let's think about a lightsaber crystal or a kyber crystal, right? In a lightsaber, yeah, it's a laser sword, doesn't that look so futuristic? But think about it. There's a lot of Force energy and a lot of, let's say, mystical elements that have to go into the construction of the lightsaber. It's not just a bit of technology that anybody can wield. You also need to have these reflexes granted to you by the Force in order to kind of properly wield one, unless you're Kathleen Kennedy making new movies and anybody, I guess, can use one. But setting that aside, the lightsaber itself is a great example, not just because it's a sword and isn't that so medieval, it is, but beyond that, it's not just, oh, look at scientific discovery. This isn't a piece of technology that can be replicated, because the whole point of the device is that there's a spiritual element to it. It's mystical, I'm not going to say magical, but it kind of is. It's not sci-fi. It's just not sci-fi. Sure, like a land speeder is not dependent on the energy and the kind of cosmic spiritual force of the universe in the way that a lightsaber is. There's other technology that just kind of seems futuristic, and so that's why I grant there is a kind of sci-fi flavor to Star Wars, but fundamentally we're not looking at a story that's about scientific advancement or technological futurism. It's really a story about a mystical battle between good and evil, and that's just not a scientific theme. Now, I'm not saying that sci-fi doesn't have stories about good and evil. Of course you can get that, but what I'm talking about is that this fundamental characteristic to sci-fi, this real privileging of a look at technology and human advancement, it's just not a central theme to Star Wars at all. Now, I could also get into some side aesthetic things. Yes, you have the swords that everyone uses, and isn't that kind of an odd weapon to choose for a futuristic setting, or scientific sci-fi setting, I guess. Yes, people have capes and they kind of dress in a medieval way. The Jedi, the Sith all do with their robes and the other aesthetics. Even the people who aren't in those factions, you have, it depends. There's lots of different cultures that are presented in Star Wars, but think of the way people are dressing. Sometimes, yes, it looks pretty sci-fi, and sometimes it's got a much more medieval kind of aesthetic and flavor. You have these grandiose buildings and these big castles, and you have places that, yeah, look like they're made out of a lot of metal, right? Like your Coruscant, for example, but also think of Naboo, think of Dantooine if you're into KOTOR and the other stuff. It's not so clear-cut that it's very obviously an imagination of human flourishing and possibility or dangers of technology in the way that we always see in sci-fi. I think what's critical to defining something as medieval fantasy or as a medieval romance is not just does it take place in the Middle Ages, right? Because medieval fantasy doesn't always have to be set in the actual Middle Ages. It has the aesthetics of it, which Star Wars does share in different ways. I've already named some. It does have these different fantastical creatures, let's say, which you might argue that Star Wars does. Yes, they're aliens, but listen, you also get some of that too. You have different races of people. They're just not or orcs or dwarves or elves. So I can see some of the troubling reasons why you might not buy into my argument that Star Wars is medieval fantasy aesthetically, but even though some of the aesthetics do line up, I think. But fundamentally, I think we're looking at a very similar narrative in Star Wars of the hero quest, the knight going off to save a lady and to defeat the evil forces that are at work, fundamentally with a reliance upon let's say generally a good spiritual force. Now, for a medieval fantasy or for medieval romance, actually in the period, you would have a heavy reliance on Christianity. Star Wars doesn't have that. It's maybe a little more Eastern in that way, but nevertheless, I think if we're looking at what's driving the action of Star Wars or what's driving the action of medieval fantasy, there is usually some kind of supernatural force at work, whether it's magic, if it's religion, if it's something else, and that's what's kind of almost choosing its hero, imbuing them with power, and motivating their good moral action to win out in the end. I think that's what Star Wars is doing. I think the trappings of the technology make us feel like it's sci-fi, but it just doesn't line up if you really think about it. So the more I think about this, the more I think I'm right. And I'm really interested if you have any thoughts, debates, totally fine. It's an ongoing discussion, but yeah, I do think that Star Wars is a medieval story in the fact that it is not just set in the past, but it's set in the distant past. It's an epic hero kind of romance quest with a knight or somebody who will become a knight. I'm thinking of A New Hope, at least, as a start. You have the mystical, kind of magical or spiritual elements to the story. The technology is there, but even a lot of the important technology is really dependent on this whole spiritual force. And it just doesn't line up with the sci-fi ethos of, oh, it's human technology and its advancement and here's how we're dealing with it. The more I think about it, yeah, I think I'm right. Star Wars is not a sci-fi story, it's a medieval fantasy story. Those are my preliminary thoughts and arguments for why I think Star Wars is a medieval fantasy and not a sci-fi story. Let me know what you think, and regardless of whether you agree with me or not, thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye.